Alhamdulillah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. May it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us clarity of thought and purpose as we approach this avenue of truth. Welcome, everyone, each and every one of you, and welcome to you, especially Brother Anwar. We're very pleased to have you with us again. Um, Now, I just want to give a brief introduction here based on some things that I'm doing. And inshallah, as is my pattern, I shoot from the hip a bit. And I hope that there is an element of synchronicity between what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and what you are about to share with us, brother. So let's just see if that is in fact the case. Um, The book I'm presently working on is called A Sexology for the Wise. Now, this is a substantial book. I've been working on it for a number of years now, and it's been a very painful and tedious process. But I think it's connected to things that are happening today. As a matter of fact, not think, I know that it's connected. And I am using the material of other people, such as, for example, Brother David Livingston, to connect dots from the ancient world and bring these things historically, politically, theologically, philosophically, sociologically, and psychologically into the present moment. Now, it's quite a task. This is what I would consider what Goethe would call Gestalt and what Islam calls Tawheed in a manner of approaching the truth. And the truth is, in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of his manifestations. When we approach the truth, we are approaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we take a step, he rushes towards us according to the Holy Quran. Alhamdulillah. Now, that's a wonderful thing to know. It's also a wonderful thing to experience. And I have experienced it as well as I know some others like yourself, brother, have experienced this form of guidance. Um, and it's a wonderful thing. It provides us with certainty, etc., etc. Now, the book that I'm working on has to do with sex and sexual relationships, the essence of sexology, the essence of our matrimonial endeavors, and the perversion of this very same thing. It's core to everything that has been perverse in the theological approaches that have been twisted. And the ancient religions all are based on what we call in mystery religions, and this has to do with fertility rites and ritual, which are very elementary approaches to um, mankind, humanity's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No matter what your persuasion, no matter what your race or creed or time or place in the ancient world, all of these religions got twisted and somehow got involved in sexual perversion. And I'm particularly looking at a point in history that has to do with what the Quran calls the advent of Harut and Marut and those other peoples, jinn and magicians who were reciting over the throne of Solomon. Um, and professing things of magic which have been perverted and then attributed to Solomon by what has become known as the Freemasonic Society. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because the history of this society is not always as clear cut as people think it is, and the majority of Freemasons don't realize it as well. And that's on purpose because their majority has been purposely diluted and led to think otherwise than what the reality at the very top of their leadership is. And that reality has to do with Jews and Medes and ancient people that were connected with what happened in Babylon during the time of Harut and Marut, and during the time of Nimrud, the fellow that confronted Ibrahim, and others of this genre and this era, such as Darius, the famous emperor, and whatnot. These people perverted what was Zoroastrianism, and they became known as magi, but not in the correct sense. And this is known by some historians. Most people who refer to these people think that they're some holy sort of gentlemen, like the three wise men who visited Jesus at the advent of that birth and all this sort of thing. The point I'm trying to make here is that Zoroaster was, according to some scholars, and I happen to agree with them, he was a prophet and a monotheist. And these people, whom Darius chased out of Babylon and Alexander the Great restored, you see, this one whom the Zoroastrians stay, even to this day, they call him Iskandar, or the accursed one, you see. And Alexander was lured into Babylon by a Jew, you see, and one of the Medes who had married into the one of the wealthy Jewish families, etc., which they always do. The same thing happened at the advent of Christianity, according to the Roman Flavians, but that's another story. The point I'm trying to make here, Brother Anwar, as you approach your uh, lesson for us today, is that from my perspective and from the historical perspective, which is very unknown to most people, I mean, God has afforded people like myself the time and the means to research these matters. Most people don't have this mm, ability, or they don't have the time or the effort, or they don't have access to the materials. So I'm approaching this dialogue from a particular perspective that has to do with the occult world outside of what happened to Islam, you see. And the experience seems to be like this, that these perverters of the truth, if you want to call them Jews, okay, you can call them Jews. But the scripture makes it pretty clear, both in the Talmud and New Testament as well as Al Quran, that they are Jews who are not Jews. So that has another meaning, which we could discuss at another time. But they are people who pervert the truth for selfish purposes. And this seems to be a pattern of infiltration and subversion and then twisting of what it is that prophets like Zoroaster and others have brought to mankind by the grace of Allah. And so, what happens, it seems to be, is that for a period, there is a perfect what Ibn Khaldun called a perfect esprit de corps, or elan vitae, a group feeling that allowed, for example, what is referred to in some of the hadith of Muslims being able to enter a town, or strangers being able to enter a town while Muslims are at Jum'ah, and none of the shops are locked because there is no sin. You see, they can trust each other. The streets are safe. So this elan vitae lasts for a while, and then the prophet dies, or his first generation of first generation of companions die off, or within 2 or 3 generations, something happens to allow the perverters to enter into this elan vitae, the company of people who are sharing this, and then begin to change it, to subvert it. This is what happened in to the Jews of old, in what we call Bani Israel, and even to the people of Abraham and Noah and Moses. You see, they were not necessarily Jews. I mean, Abraham, you can't consider him a Jew. He was not a Jew. This term Jew didn't become a popular term until until close to the advent of Christ. So, ancient Israel was Bani Israel. They were called by other names, but these people, these subverters, these lovers of the religion of Pharaoh, which religion the Al Quran makes it very clear that God hates, and that religion is based on the mystery religions that are based on fertility cults, which is a perversion of sexuality. Okay, it's a perversion of marriage, which is what Rumi called the imago Dei, the reflection of God's relationship with us as human beings. You see, so this perversion creeps in, and the reason that I'm interested in talking to you about what you know about how Islam became. How Islam was steered off course. I'm sure there are parallels, and I don't know these parallels because I don't have access to the sources. I don't have access to the Arabic language. I don't have translations, and I'm schooled in other disciplines, you see. So I'm looking at this from the outside, and you're looking at it more closely from the inside. So I'm interested in bringing our perspectives together for the sake of our students, for the sake of the listener, for the sake of anyone who tunes into this particular broadcast in search of the truth, of what it is that happened to the message that was brought by our beloved Prophet Muhammad. So, brother, with that being said, I'll hand the floor over to you, and may it please Allah to grant us clarity here.
Thank you, Dr. Zaid. Alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastahdi. And again, I also add my thanks to Allah, the Almighty, our Creator, for bringing us together on this forum. And we ask Allah to guide me. I ask Allah to clarify my understanding also. You clearly, I will, grant you that the knowledge that you are obviously, possessing in terms of the historical sort of satanic church, that the concept of that type of perversive force in history. I think I sense that your knowledge is much more coherent and complete on that particular topic. As far as I go, I think I might have snatches of knowledge in terms of what you're referring to, but by no means do I have that type of understanding that you clearly have. So when I do speak, maybe you would be able to draw the links and to, see where the things that I bring to the conversation can match up with your existing understanding. But what I can say is that clearly there is a disruptive and a perversive force at work, according to my reading of history also, especially Muslim history, the history immediately following the life of the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam. And the way it enters is not in the form of head-on confrontation, because that type of challenge played itself out during the lifetime of the Prophet and was clearly defeated. So any head-on direct confrontation was met and was eliminated. So the challenge or the disruptive forces then came in the form more of perverting aspects of the teachings of the Prophet and the teachings of the Quran. And so, yes, I do clearly see a connection with what you are saying there. I've read somewhat of the history of Christianity, and I've read and I've identified the role of Paul as such a possible disruptive force that took the essentially simple and humanitarian and egalitarian message of Jesus Christ and turned it into a very, very highly doctrinal message, and with lots of with the image of Christ being perverted, of course, at the center of it all. So I can clearly see there's other areas where this type of approach, where this type of disruption has taken place. For example, Christianity, then you've mentioned Zoroastrianism. I have absolutely no knowledge as far as that is concerned. And I think it matches up with what the Quran says. The Quran, in fact, speaks about a nation that was the original recipient of the wahi, or the true message from Allah, the original nation of the covenant, the Bani Israel, and who was the original nation that undertook the covenant with Almighty Allah to exemplify the message, the divine message on earth. But then the Quran, from the very first, in fact, from the second chapter, already exposes the transgressions and the perversions that took place within that, under that covenant, and how that covenant was broken in the process.
Yes.
Whether it is something connected to Judaism, I will dispute that. I think I will call it the Church of Satan. I think it is. Farrakhan once was asked, are you anti-Jew? And he said, I'm not anti-Jew. I'm anti-Satan, or something like that, to that effect. And I think the Jewish people, the good people who follow the Torah, and I think they are unaware even of this disruptive force which is at work.
That's true.
And so
that is true.
I don't think they should, if they should by any chance be watching this video, then I would clearly tell them that this is not something that that is in reference to you as a good follower of the Torah and as trying to be a good practicing Jew, or even not even a practicing Jew. So I think what we're saying is that there is a force, whether it's Jewish, whether it's non-Jewish, whether it's whatever. I think that I concur with you that that force is discernible. And when we look at Hadith, clearly that force is at work. So if we should then explore the way that Islam has developed after the Prophet, then I think we will be able to see that force at work also. So I don't know how you'd like us to proceed with this, Dr. Zaid. If we do get questions from our listenership, from the listening audience, that would be great, and they could interrupt. Otherwise, I could just forge ahead and maybe raise one or two issues.
Yeah, let me just say that I invite our listeners to, if you have questions, please, Brother Kamal, make it possible for them to post their questions, and screen them, of course, to make sure that they're appropriate and associated with the topic at the moment. While Brother Anwar is proceeding with his explication here, we can perhaps from time to time entertain those questions and use them also as a guidance for this particular program. We could also save them for a Q&A to immediately follow the end of Brother Anwar's discussion here. So as is the case in any story, Brother Anwar, begin at the beginning.
Okay. Look, I think let's begin right at the beginning. In the case of this story that I'm going to be speaking about or narrating around, it is at the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And so we don't have any disputes. There are really no doctrinal disputes or any political disputes during the lifetime of the Prophet. It's a very clear line of demarcation between those who are believers, the mu'mineen, and the kafirin. The kafirin are clearly those who reject the message They reject the validity of the Prophet's status. They reject the authenticity of the Quran or the validity of the Quran, the reading that the Prophet recites to them. And so it's a very clear separation. Even after his death, I must say, even soon after his death, in there's a period of approximately 30 to 35 years after his death, where there's a reasonable, although there are some conflict, generally people are generally united around the office of what they call the caliph. And although there might have been a dispute early on between Imam Ali and the rest, generally that seems to have been overcome. I will add to that, even after that, when the caliphs, the four good caliphs, as they are generally referred to, the guided caliphs, after their time, and it is the time of the inherited kings now, the monarchies.
Yes.
The first monarchy is the House of Umayyad. And during this period, in fact, there's then clearly political conflict. Now, let me just bring up a point here. You mentioned earlier that there's always this perversive force at work.
Yes.
And I want to then add a second dynamic to that analysis, and that is, the kings and those who want to maintain their grip on power.
Yes.
They then have access to this disruptive or perversive force, and they may draw on it or they may not. Like Pharaoh, for example, he had his wise men, and they were there to conjure up arguments and doctrines and understandings and thinking that he would be able to access and harness to his own benefit. But he would use it in a way that buttresses his own rule, that reinforces his own claim to power. And so I think what happens with the Umayyad kings is that they then start tapping on this latent force that is already in existence.
Yes.
And I've made mention of some of the characters that are within the ranks of the friends of the Prophet. Now, the Prophet was outlived by many thousands of his companions. When he passed away, I would guess thousands of them were still continued to be active within his society. And one of these, and there are many, some like him, was Abu Huraira,
Yes.
who was in the company of the Prophet for a brief period, I think for 2 years, definitely not more than 3 years. And these are the final 2 or 3 years of the Prophet's life, in fact. And these characters become extremely active in producing ideas, thoughts. And at first, the ideas were mere reproductions or narrations of the Prophet's words. So they would have no ideas of their own. They would merely say that, listen, this is what I heard the Prophet say. And so it became very innocent. It started out very innocently as like, this is what I thought I heard the Prophet say. And that was in the early years after the Prophet. The first 4 caliphs, as I said, they were very intimate with the Prophet. So there was no chance of influencing them with any of these reports from the Prophet.
Yes.
But of course, when they passed on, then you had caliphs who were not really familiar with the Prophet, like, for example, Muawiyah, the first Umayyad king, not really a close companion of the Prophet. In fact, he hails from the family that opposed the Prophet. And so with his son, who never even met the Prophet. And so when the sons of the friends of the Prophet started ruling, they then added or attached more value to the words of Abu Huraira and these characters. And then suddenly these guys became more. And the way they tried to use the words of Abu Huraira was, in as far as these people like Abu Huraira, their words supported the legitimacy, their legitimacy.
Yes.
So, for example, Abu Huraira would preach that the Arabs, are more entitled to holding the kingdom or the kingship, and so they would draw on the words of Abu Huraira in as far as it actually supported their legitimacy. Muawiyah did it extensively, so he would actually surround himself with these guys who would come up with statements of the Prophet that were in his favor. So they would then use these characters to legitimize their own position. And so as you say, these characters were running around fabricating or coming up with stories of the Prophet in support of Muawiyah. Muawiyah, of course, in charge of the treasury, would make it worth their while. And some of them would get excellent positions, appointments within the broad empire, within that civil service. It is a time of extreme opulence and growth and financial prosperity, because by that time, the Persian Empire is now incorporated within the Muslim world. Parts of the old Roman Byzantine Empire is now included in parts of the Muslim world. So in other words, Egypt, Jerusalem, these are old Roman possessions that are now part of the Muslim empire. So the kings, the Umayyad kings, are they create a lot of prosperity, lots of opportunities for people and the new generation of scholars that would produce ideas in their support. So the Hadith falsification or the fabrication of Hadith is at an all-time high in the Umayyad period. That is really the period where Hadiths are manufactured. It's probably the greatest period of Hadith manufacturing in support
Now,
of the
can I interrupt you for a minute? Do you say manufactured versus manipulated? I mean, you can take a correct saying, even a relatively true hearsay, if you will, and misapply it. And that's not necessarily a fabrication, but it's a misapplication. So was there a combination of both here, or are you just saying, okay, well, these guys just started to make stuff up in order to gain the king's favor and to get themselves a position or pension or whatever the case might be?
Both, Dr. You would get both. You would get a misinterpretation or a incorrect interpretation of authentic words of the Prophet. I'm trying to think of an example, but there are numerous fabrications as well. So people would invent verses hadiths such as that Ali is the person who fights with Ali is in the wrong, or those who stand with the Jamaat will always be in the or the 73 sects. And
yes.
So in other words, promoting the virtuousness of standing with the majority would be especially promoted as an article of belief. And so
that's interesting,
so
because
it still stands.
I can interject here that science now knows that the majority is most often incorrect. You see,
Absolutely.
because they're
Absolutely.
incorrectly informed. The Catholics have proven this for upwards of 1,000 years or more, following their ascension in Rome. They were incorrectly informed. Their majority believed what they were told, and then that led to the Crusades and all sorts of terrible happenings. And this then was followed by the advent of the printing press, which then proved that the Latins in Rome were lying, you see, about what the scripture said. So the majority is not always correct. So what you're saying here is that some of these hadith were pushing that concept, and that concept only holds true if what people are taught is, in fact, the truth. And if these are misapplications or if these are fabrications, then the majority is following a lie or at
Yeah.
least some form of diversion from the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, if you read the Quran, the spirit of the Quran is always that most people do not get guidance or do not find guidance. Most people will be fuel for the fire. So the spirit of the Quran is that, unfortunately, the majority of people always choose not to do the right thing.
Yes.
And so this idea of sticking to the majority, which is especially the position advanced by Muawiyah, and even during the war with Imam Hussein, where the Hussein was 80 something of his companions fought something like 40,000 of the army of Yazid. So the argument was then stick to the majority and be safe. And there's a hadith like that, in fact, the hadith of the 73 sects, where it states that, the Jews were divided into 72 and the Muslims will be divided into 73, something to that effect. Most of them will be in hell except the one. And then the hadith as a concluding point, the majority, stick to the majority. So with the Jama'at. And in fact, the word, the Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'at, it in fact alludes to that idea of the sticking to the majority. The Ahli Sunnah means those who are observers of the Sunnah of the Prophet, the tradition of the Prophet, wal Jama'at, and who form part of the body, the large body to the Jama'at. And so that concept was highly exploited by Muawiyah and his successors, that the majority of people are with us, and so we can't be wrong.
I see.
And, in fact, so that was the sort of the way that they advanced their legitimacy. But the Umayyads never really invented a lot of religious doctrines. So their idea was to establish and maintain political legitimacy. So to establish and maintain their grip over power. And I guess in that way they were very similar to the Romans. The Romans were not a very thoughtful or intellectual force in history. That was the Greeks.
Yes.
And interestingly, my reading of the Muslim history is that the Umayyads absorbed a lot of the ancient Roman sort of thinking. It was more about conquest and power, whereas the real philosophical and theological period, the fertile theological period, comes many years after the Umayyads. In fact, the Umayyads ruled for about, I think, 90 years. And as I say, their main idea is to establish and maintain political power and legitimacy, and to harness or to recruit hadith and hadith stories to maintain that legitimacy. And they have Abu Huraira, an agent of the Umayyad Empire, in fact, who received a position under one of the kings, appointed as the Amir of, I believe, Bahrain, the governor there. So, in fact, a post holder. He took up a position within the Umayyad Empire. So there's clearly, he has a political affiliation, Abu Huraira. And so when we read these hadiths, we have to read. But I think where the real problem comes in, because the Umayyad abuse of hadiths was largely exposed within the next, say, 100 years, because they were so
Is that
blatant.
so?
And yeah, they were very,
I
very,
don't
very
think our
blatant.
listeners realize that this exposure. This is something that's new to me. So this perversion, this misuse, and this fabrication of hadith, what you're saying is that it was already exposed early on. You see,
Absolutely.
after the offense. So tell us
Absolutely.
about that, brother. We need to know about that. Our listeners want to know. I want to know what happened.
Yeah, you see, the civil war, the third civil war, under between the Caliph, the Umayyads, and some of the companions of the Prophet, in fact, split the Muslim world already, and that was between a famous companion of the Prophet called Ibn Zubayr, and
Yes.
there Ibn Zubayr declared himself to be the king in around about 700 after current era, common era. He declared himself, and so he split away from the Umayyads, and he formed his own sort of empire, sort of mini state within the bigger state. Then there were also provinces within the east, towards in the old Persian Empire, in particular Kufa, that formed breakaway regions. So the Umayyads had to deal with the breakaway regions, and these breakaway regions, they used the degeneracy, the religious degeneracy of the Umayyad kings as a rallying point. So that was the way they could get the masses within those breakaway regions to become alienated from the kings, and so they would point to the moral corruption of the kings. Yazid, for example, he was a drinker, he was abstain of salah and some other vice that he got involved with, and even one of the kings, Walid, they were known to be users of alcohol, and by that time I think alcohol was already a very big taboo. And so the rallying point was religious. There was a religious rallying point against the Umayyads. And that religious rallying point also rallied using the name of the Prophet's great-grandchildren, his surviving descendants. So that the surviving descendants of the Prophet were people like Jafar, Sadiq's son, Riza, and so they used religious malpractices of the kings and also the family of the Prophet, the miserable status of the family of the Prophet who had been massacred at Karbala in 61, and who had been in a constant state of siege by the kings, by the Umayyad kings, the subject of much slander and abuse by the Umayyad priests who were on Fridays. The Umayyads, in fact, made it an aspect of the Friday prayers or the Friday gathering to curse Ali and to curse the spreaders of disunity, as they called it. And so that's
not exactly Islamic, no, is it?
Of course. Well, but what we must keep in mind is that the Islam that you and I might think of now as a neatly formed body of rules and knowledge and history was not quite perfected to that extent. Maybe they had the book, they had the Quran. Undoubtedly, that was there, but there was absolutely no clear jurisprudence. There was no body of law. There was no literary tradition of hadith. There was no scholarly fraternity as we have now. There would be no mazhabs. So you had the book. The book is extremely denominational. I mean, if you look at the Quran, it doesn't even make the Muslims much better than the Christians. The Quran refers to Christians and Muslims. Whoever does well will find their place with Allah. So it doesn't particularly make the Muslims even a better category of people. In a way, declares a nation. It declares Muslim more as an adjective than as a nation.
Yes.
Being a Muslim is not really in reference to any religious denomination in the Quran. So we mustn't picture. So it's a political empire at this stage. It's more of political empire. It's not yet a religious empire, I believe, at this point. Where it becomes a religious empire, because that was really the genius of the Abbasid kings. It takes us back to, the idea of Marx that religion is the real opium of the masses.
Yes.
And the Abbasids really, they understood that political allegiance is fickle. And you might have the masses with you one day, and as was the case with the Umayyads, you might lose them suddenly one day when you wake up. And the Abbasids are really the kings, and not the early Abbasids, the Abbasids that come after Ma'mun. So about, say, 4 or 5 kings into the Abbasid dynasty, they make the realization that it is really through religious doctrine and through religious allegiance by which you then associate the king with God, or you place the king into a greater understanding, a greater religious order, that you can create a much more permanent form of legitimacy for your king. And so that is really the time of theological richness, where theologically a lot more work is done, and where hadiths then acquire completely new meaning. So hadith now no longer serves merely to say that the Arabs are good and the majority is good and the Umayyads are good, and raising positive comments from the Prophet about the family of the Umayyads. But now it actually brings in a whole body of law, and it establishes a doctrinal order, which happens about 4 or 5 kings into the Abbasid. So what happens during the first 5 or so kings, which is the original kings of the Abbasid Empire? You see, they were freshly, when they were victorious, they had to pay some sort of homage to the family of the Prophet, in whose name they advanced their civil uprising or their insurrection around about 750 Common Era. So they come to power around about 750, which is about 140 years after the Prophet's death. And they reinstitute, in fact, some sort of respect or reverence for the family of the Prophet. At that time, I think it was the 8th descendant of the Prophet there was always one descendant of the Prophet who was recognized as the Imam. And there was sort of a parallel structure with the ruling empire in terms of the Prophet's descendants. So there was always an Imam, and these were the Shia Imams of that time. But they were sort of regarded as dissidents. But there's a small interlude of approximately maybe 40 years to 80 years. I've got the exact numbers here, where the Imams or the family of the Prophet is regarded with less suspicion and less animosity. Now, this is the golden age of Islam, the first, say, 150 years of Abbasid rule. Is regarded as the golden age of Islam. This is the age between approximately 750 and about 890 or 900. It's the era of scientific progress. It's the age of intellectual flourishing throughout the Muslim lands, where Baghdad becomes the magnificent city of knowledge and research. It is the time of Ibn Sina, the great Muslim physician. It is the time of all these great scholars that we now, sort of try to portray as the great Muslim mathematicians and the great Muslim philosophers. So that is the period, the first period of the Abbasid rule, where there is really no religious or theological advancement much. The Quran is there, and there's a heck of a lot of rational and intellectual work going on. But it is now, okay, let's see who are the scholars of that time. At that time, we have the emergence of people like Shafi'i, Imam Shafi'i. We have people like Abu Hanifa, and they clearly find themselves at odds with the ruling kings, who are extremely rationalist in outlook. So Ma'mun, for example, these kings are absolute rationalists. They see no place for doctrinal positions or extreme legalistic positions, and they operate purely on the Quran and the Mu'tazilah is really the official state philosophy. I think the word Mu'tazilah, you should be familiar with it. The school of Wasil ibn Atta, the Mu'tazila school is regarded as the rationalist school. It predates the Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'at. It predates the mazhabs, the four mazhabs that we know now. It predates the Hadith scholars like Bukhari. And the Mu'tazila school, translated roughly as the rationalist school, is simply a school of thought that believes that the world is rational, it is understandable, and man can fathom or can make sense of the world. And the Quran is there to augment and to complement the intellect of man. And so the Mu'tazila school is really very, very highly rationalistic. It finds very strong affinity with the Aristotelian thinking and that whole sense of rationality and empiricism, etc., find very strong connection there. But that
it's more anthrocentric than theocentric.
Precisely.
If there's any theocentrism, the theological perspective is just to establish divine right of the king, which was developed later in Christianity as well, by the same sort of approach to philosophy and rationalism, if you will. Okay, that's understandable. Thank you very much. I didn't really fully realize that.
And that's an extensive period of approximately over 100 years, over a century. Then a new challenge emerges to the kings, because there's always going to be a challenger, and there's always going to be the challenger will always use an argument or a discourse or a position to legitimize their challenge. And that new challenge comes in the form of a theological challenge. And so you get a person like Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who is a hadith expert par excellence. He is really, as I said in a previous discussion with you, Dr. Zaid, he is hadith master on steroids. Whereas his teacher, Shafi'i, who operated within the old Persian Empire, within the area of Kufa, which is roughly speaking Baghdad of today, a very, very active, vibrant part of the Muslim world intellectually, but also an extremely important part of the old Jewish schools Surat and Pumbedita, in fact, sitting a day's travel by horse away from Baghdad or Kufa. So Surat and Pumbedita, just down the river, where the Euphrates makes a turn. These schools are situated there.
Yes, yes. I'm familiar with that school, that place, because it is mentioned in histories 1,000 years previously during the captivity of the Jews in Babylon. You see, so this same school has been there for 1,000 years already, more than 1,000 years, and this is the school out of which the Haskalah, the Mishnah, the Kabbalah, and the other books that now guide what has become modern day Judaism. It's not ancient Judaism. This is modern day Judaism. This is the school from where all of that arrives. And all of their scholars, even Maimonides, the medieval scholar, they all refer to this school. And this school, or that you mentioned, this site which you mentioned, is part of the ancient Assyrian human sacrificing cult. And they insinuated themselves. This was established by the same lineage of kings that Abraham had confronted. You see, the Jews were transplanted there during their captivity. They intermarried, and then they all came back and to the northern Israel later, and then they were transported back in another captivity on another occasion because they resorted to the hedonism and the idolatry, the human sacrificing idolatry of their captives. So they practiced the so-called what is it called? The Scandinavian syndrome that's practiced by those who are taken captive, you see. And they incorporated these ideas. So that school that you just mentioned, you see, with respect to Shafi'i, is ancient, is well established. And the Jews remained. All of these other Assyrian adepts and whatnot, they faded away. The Babylonians faded away along with the Sumerians and what became what were the Amorites. But this Amorite idea, according to the Arcana of the Old Testament, there's a scripture that says that the iniquity, the evil of the Amorite has not yet come to its full. And when it comes to its full, that is when the day of judgment is supposed to arrive. You see, now that has all sorts of metaphysical implications without going into eschatology, you see. But these are the people, that was the center of the Amorite evil, you see. And this is where the Jews established their ancient synagogues that incorporated the magic that I was talking about, you see. And we could spend another seminar, an entire seminar, discussing that magic that has to do with this particular sexual perversion. But this is what you're talking. The people that were part of that school had an influence over this gentleman that we know as Shafi'i. Is that correct?
Well, that is certainly my suggestion, is that, you see, Shafi'i he comes from a very old traditional community in Gaza. He's born there around about 150 after the Hijrah. In other words, if you add about 6, he's born about 750, just in the time of the Umayyads. And he develops an understanding of Islam and fiqh. He never calls anyone to follow him. He just develops it. And he's a student of Malik, who is a citizen of Medina. So he goes to Malik and he learns from Malik, who is a citizen of Medina, who's a tabi'in. Tabi'in is somebody who actually met the Sahaba. So Malik lives in Medina. He met some of the friends of the Prophet. And he's authored a book called the Muwatta. And in this book, he collects a whole lot of religious practices and beliefs that he gained from these friends of the Prophet in Medina. So Shafi sets off to Medina, where he then goes and learns from students of Malik. Malik's book is around still, and some of the students of Malik are now in Medina teaching the book of Malik. He then travels across the Muslim world to the other side of the peninsula, and he visits Yemen, and he visits, then eventually ends up in Kufa. So in his travels, which over a period of 20 years or 15 years, he completely reverses a lot of his early teaching or the things he learned from Malik. And that I say, and these changes in him take place in Kufa when he's there. Because he travels to Kufa, and there he meets the students of the other great scholar, Abu Hanifa, who also no longer around. He meets his students, and he sits with his students. And so he's now taken in some of the teachings of Malik. He's taken in some of the teachings of Abu Hanifa. And then in this stay, which is an extensive stay in Kufa, I think more than 5 years or 8 years he spends there. He undergoes some very radical changes in his philosophical and in his religious positions. It is there that he authors the book, the Risala, where he operates Hadith as a co-essential component of knowledge, as an epistemic component of knowledge. So he adds Hadith, the body of Hadith, then as a second source of unquestionable truthfulness or veracity along with the Quran. So the text of the Quran is then augmented with the body of Hadith. And not Hadith in the sense of Hadith as a literary source of information, but Hadith as divine text. So Hadith is incorporated. It would have been okay if Hadith was incorporated as a corpus of text that could be scrutinized and evaluated, but Hadith was incorporated pretty much as divine text. So what I'm saying, his student is Ibn Hanbal. Ibn Hanbal is the student of Shafi'i. And he takes this idea that Hadith is a co-essential component of Islamic knowledge, and he runs with it. And he then goes on a absolute mission to collect hadiths. So Ibn Hanbal, he travels every center where he could find any remnants of hadith. And between the year is approximately 270 after Hijrah. In other words, in the era, if we add 600 years, we're hitting the end of the 800s now, the late 800s. So Ibn Hanbal becomes a challenger, or he challenges the Abbasid rationalist kings. And in fact, he's arrested, and he is apparently tortured also, from what we read, for coming up with irrational positions. So he's one irrational position he advances, which becomes an extremely powerful lobbying point, is the createdness of the Quran. Based on Hadith, Ibn Hanbal, the student of Shafi'i, the Hadith champion, advances the position that the Quran is uncreated and co-eternal with God. So it is the first attempt.
A useless argument, by the way.
But also, if you look at the position of Jesus, it's a very similar argument that Jesus, the Paulian position is that Jesus is co-eternal with God. In other words, shares in the divinity of God. And the position of Jesus is inseparable from the divinity of God. So what Ibn Hanbal does is sort of a similar position, but using the Quran now instead of Jesus. And the position which is rejected by the early Abbasid kings, and for which he is, in fact, punished. I think he's tortured or incarcerated. But he becomes a martyr to the cause of Hadith. So Ibn Hanbal, he becomes a rallying point for those who want to advance the position of Hadith and who oppose the purely rational position of the Abbasid kings. That is really when the stage is set for the theologians to launch their attack against the Abbasid kings. But maybe if there's anything you'd like to comment, I just want to maybe you still follow the idea here where we are.
Yes.
Hadith. I'm trying to explain how Hadith really becomes prominent within the body of Islam.
Well, let me draw a parallel here with what I know of the Persian history with regard to Zoroastrianism, because the true Zoroastrianisms, they are monotheists. They were not idolaters. They had a relationship somewhat with I wouldn't say fire worship, but they had an understanding of the nature of light, the nature that has been since twisted into what the Illuminati call enlightenment, what the Freemasons call enlightenment. It can all be traced back there. Now, what the Zoroastrians say in their history is that it was approximately 300 years after the death of Zoroaster that the perversion of his monotheism took place. You see? So here we have another parallel. There seems to be some sort of a temporal relationship, because the same thing happened to the doctrines of Buddha, if you will. And the same things happened to the doctrines of whoever the gentleman was who became known as Odin. Okay. He was enshrined as a god. Some people, some sects, pseudo-Islamic sects, actually enshrine Zoroaster as a god, you see. And some of these so-called Aryan sects have enshrined their prophets as gods. This is what happened also to Isa, you see. He's been enshrined as a god. So it always happens, 300 years or so afterwards, because if you look at the history of Christianity, it wasn't until the Synod of Nicaea under Constantine that Jesus Christus became a god. I mean, there were arguments before that, but it became official. So what we're talking about here is the beginning of an official twist and an official establishment of a doctrinary position that is not necessarily in keeping with what the prophet had established as Islam, you see. And this has historical precedent in other so-called religions. So I can add that to the mix here. Now, what I want to get back to before we go any further, because I want to see if we can't continue this discussion along these lines, you see, because this history is complicated, but you're actually helping us to make it simple, you see, so that now we have our eyes on a couple of historical figures. We've got Hurera, we got Muawiyah, we've got the Abbasids, we've got the other groups who claim, they took the emphasis away from the caliphate, and it suddenly became a hereditary monarchy. Well, this is not Islam. So this perversion took place early on. And you have to say, well, why is this? We've got the divine right of the kings, which crept into the Catholic perversions. And Not that there isn't a divine right and that Allah doesn't legitimize particular persons even outside of his perfect will, because there's a permissive will and a perfect will. And this is what happened to, for example, to Prophet Dawood. You see, Samuel, the prophet at the time, he was the caliph, if you will, of Bani Israel at the time. And the people came to him and said, "We want a king like the Gentiles. We want to be just like the Goys, because we're getting tired of being pushed around by their army. So we want a king, we want armies, we want a castle, we want Camelot." Okay? So Samuel cried out to God, and God said, "Give them what they want." This is in Al Torah, you see. So it's not that Allah doesn't permit these things; He certainly does, but it's according to our will. You see, the will of those who wish to disobey Him. So this same sort of disobedience apparently crept into Islam early on, and most of our scholars just ignore this thing. You see, they ignore it as if it's not important. Well, if we accept the hadith about the raisin-headed black man being the caliph, well, this goes against what happened. You see, with the monarchies that followed after the murder of Ali and the demise of even Subir, who some continued to be, the sixth righteously guided caliph, if you will. But what I'm trying to establish here, for the sake of our listeners, is how did this influence creep in? We have an idea now that we know it crept in. This is undisputed now. And so we can agree that there was a discordant, subversive element that's crept into Islam right away with Muawiyah, and it remained. It was challenged, but the challenge was weak. You can say, okay, on Hanbal, he was martyred for his position, but equating the Hadith with the Quran is hardly a sound position. You see, because what he's equating here is the science of hearsay, and the science of hearsay cannot be accepted in any court of law. If you go into a court of law and say, "Well, I heard so and so say such and such and such and such and such and such," that would never be accepted as evidence, never, under any circumstances. But the entire body of traditional Islam has accepted this as if it's established science, and then equated theologically, you see, with the Quran, as if Allah Himself is speaking His words. Well, this is untenable, you see. So this thing crept in. This perversion crept into Islam. Now we have identified some major principal figures, and we want to identify, we've got this school in ancient Persia near Babylon, this Jewish school that we know is associated with Shafi'i now. But who else is it associated with? Who else are the Jews who are not Jews but crept into Islam? Who else amongst the Islamic scholars are they associated with? This is a question that we want to answer and approach, with God willing, and to identify these people so that our listeners, who are eager students who want to know what really happened, we all know something happened, but our scholars are ignoring the fact that this thing happened. They don't want to discuss it. Whenever I brought it to the table, it was not important. It was considered insignificant. We moved right on to the Golden Age, you see, which you identify with the beginning of the Abbasids, and it ended with Genghis Khan. So that was a horrible and horrific ending, but it was an ending that came to an evil that crept into Islam 700 years previously, you see, or 600 years previously, whatever the time the frame was. So who were these people that influenced these kings? This evil influence that runs tandem and runs parallel with the idea of the divine right of the kings, which Allah made very clear in Al-Tarat, is not his will. His will is the
Yeah.
caliphate. His will is
Mm.
prophethood. His
Yeah.
will is for the people to be guided by what we can reasonably say is what Moses wrote as the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. I just had a discussion with a couple of young Amish workers who are doing some building for us here on the farm, and they're fine young men. I wouldn't trust most work that I would like to hire out to any other people, because you can't, especially to Muslims, you can't get them to do the work correctly. They're always cheating. They're always lazy. They're always going to pray. They're always, there's always some excuse. They're sick, or there's a holiday, or whatever. But the Amish, you tell the Amish what you want, and 2 weeks later the thing is done. Okay, and from start to finish, the whole thing is finished in 2 or 3 days. Once the negotiations are finished, they do it. So I'm having a discussion with one of these men, and one of my brothers is here talking about Islam with him out in the field. And we're out in the field, all right. We just set down a new chicken coop which the Amish workers had built for us, and so he's talking about the Islam and explaining Islam's position. I walk up to them, and they're fine young men, and they're prime, the prime of the late 20s, early 30s, strong strength, and handsome as handsome can be, and as earnest can be. And I looked at and I listened for just a minute, and my young companion finished his statement. I said, and then I looked at the Amish men, and I said, "Look, you have to forgive him. He gets a bit rambunctious." And they looked at me with renewed interest. See, the old bearded man has come to talk now. So I said to him, "Look, it's like this. Islam is not difficult. We look at the word Muslim. Muslim means he who submits to the will of Allah. And I said, this will can be expressed in two different ways. You can say, okay, you look at the Decalogue of Moses. I said, the 10 Commandments. And they said, oh, yes, we know them. I said, you keep them, correct? Yes, we do keep them. I said, well, that's wonderful, because that makes you a Muslim, you see. And then I said, and those commandments are all connected in what Isa said are the two great commandments. Love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. All of the law is in there. And I said, well, this is it. And if this is what you do, then in my mind, you're a Muslim. If you want to think Jesus is God, that makes no difference to me. I say, you can believe that. But if you keep those commandments, that's what's important to me. That's all that's important to me. And that makes you a Muslim, as far as I'm concerned. And they just smiled on their face, and they said, oh, now we understand. I said, I can trust you, and I keep those commandments to the best of my ability, and you can trust me, and we can do business together. So it's kind of like that, okay? Something crept into Islam to take the position away from those commandments, to take the focus of the human mind away from Allah, away from the prophetic commandments, because that's what they are. If you accept that Musa gave us those commandments, and that the promises made to Abraham and to Moses were completed in the life and the work of Prophet Muhammad, then that's it. You see, that focus is on the caliphate, because the caliphate represents prophethood. It represents submission to prophethood, and that then represents submission to Allah through his prophet. You see, so that's what the caliphate is. So when you take the emphasis away and you place it on the king and a monarchy, especially a hereditary monarchy, that is perversion. That's a perversion of the truth. Now, let's go back to this Jewish school in the ancient Babylonian kingdom. That ancient Babylonian kingdom was set up by the one that they called Sargon. Sargon the great lawgiver. Now, Sargon may well have been a prophet. We don't know. But let's just say that he was. And the same thing happened to him that happened to all prophets. After a few generations, he becomes a god. Everything's messed up. These people come back in, they create their own hadith, their own theological perspective, and they ruin things, and then they take over the educational process. That's what happened. And when the Jews were taken captive in Babylon, they joined with these people at that school. And what was that school doing? That school was keeping the records, the financial records that had been carried forth from the ancient Sumerian kingdom. And the ancient Sumerian kings were the ones who established riba. All right. Now, am I connecting the dots for you, brother?
Yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
This is a way that makes sense. Now, you see, this is why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And I love that we are connecting these things to a greater historical reality, and that we're not just looking at the Hadith as a uniquely Muslim corruption, but it is a tactic that has been used throughout history.
Yes.
If the way I'd like to look at it is that, in the sort of Hegelian way, that Allah has created a grinding stone, almost like to sharpen the Muslim resolve. And that grinding stone is this Church of Satan, or this historic legacy or tradition of perversion.
Yes.
And they are forever there grinding up against those who want to serve Allah in its most pure, honest way. And they are always there trying to, wither away at the pristine purity of Islam, or being a mu'min. And so that same force is there forever. And many people are recruited within that order unknowingly or innocently. I'm not saying that Ibn Hanbal is necessarily an evil person. He could be an innocent guy who was recruited within a greater structure that had to serve the purpose of solidifying the king's position, of estranging people from a rational outlook in the world, and to turn the masses away from being rational to being blind followers. Because it's easier to manipulate blind followers than thinking people. Why is the West powerful in any case today is because they abandoned the blind following of religion, and credit to the Enlightenment of the 1700s and the 1800s for turning the Western citizen, or the Westerner, or the person of the European and the American, against the priests who were calling to blind following, the Catholic priests and of the Middle Ages. And so, and that is that same temptation, I think, that happens to overthrow the king, Ma'mun, and the rationalist Abbasids. You have to make an appeal, and you have to attach yourself to something that has sacred value. So the Quran has sacred value, and the intellect has sacred value. So can we add something else with sacred value and with currency? Hadith seems to be the useful prop, and let's make hadith that sacred new element, and so it can detract from thinking and rationalizing and intellectualizing to simply accepting the wording on its face. So I think it is, if you think of it like that, it is actually a form of shirk. Then it is a form of shirk. It is a form of raising something to the level of divinity on a par with Allah's word. And that's exactly what happened. Is hadith was raised to the level of divinity that only the Quran should possess. The power, and it was used to overthrow the rationalist kings within the Abbasid dynasty, and to bring to power kings like Mustasim or Mutawakkil. I'm not too sure now the names, who abandoned the school of wisdom, or the Darul Hikmah, that was established by the early Abbasid kings, the house of knowledge and science. And so they then used the Hadith as their new philosophical legitimizing force, and very successfully so. Of course, the Abbasids did not last long, because the ulama, or the clergy, the priesthood, the emerging priesthood that came into being with this new idea of Hadith, and with law and with Sharia, it brought about a completely new generation of priesthood, because now you had people who codified, or who turned the words of Shafi'i and Hanafi and Maliki into laws, into what new codes of law, and which soon became absorbed into the official state of the Abbasids. As the official state religion, and there you have the emergence of a state religion now based on Hadith, etc. So that really solidifies the rule of the Abbasids. But it is really the Seljuk Turks who overthrow much of the Abbasid power round about in the 11th century, round about, say, I think in the late 900s. It is really the Seljuk Turks that come from the edges of the Muslim world, from the fringes of the Muslim world, and that uses orthodoxy and the clergy as a battle cry, who really creates the Islam that we experience today. These Seljuk Turks, they then turn Islam into a religious / legalistic kind of community, abandoning all the previous ideas of being an egalitarian, intellectual, free thinking kind of community on a par with the Christians and with any other religious communities, and turn it into a hard and insulated community. And that is pretty much the Islam we have today, is that the Islam created under the Seljuk Turks. And
I see.
Unfortunately,
can we stop there for this session now, brother? And let's pick it up there. Let's take it from the Seljuk Turks on the next meeting, and then after that session, I would like to go back again to the meeting, to the beginning, and review this. But see exactly where the influences came in according to what you and then see if we can find some complementary correlations, which I may or may not have in my own set of knowledge here. So I want to thank you, brother, for sharing with us today. And if we can meet again next week, the same time, let's just go ahead and schedule it. And as long as Allah permits, we'll try and keep this a kind of a weekly session, so that we can complete this course of discussion for the sake of our listeners and for the sake of our own edification. Alhamdulillah. So with that being said, brother, I'll say to you and to our audience, wassalamu alaikum
wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah
wa barakatuh.
Salam.